I'm back. We had a little technical difficulty here, but all's good with the world right now. Contingency, that's where I left off. Just make sure you mark the appropriate box, whether you're releasing all of the contingencies or certain ones. Make sure you check the proper box, 2A, B, or C. Make sure that the seller signs a contingency release if there's a seller's contingency. So, for example, if there's a contingency on the seller to find another property suitable to them, then make sure when they find that suitable property that they sign a contingency release within the allotted time that they have to release that contingency. Stay on top of that because that's really important to the close of the escrow, and obviously it's important to the checklist to get that signed off so that you're able to make sure your check comes in on time once the escrow does close. Cancellation. I've run into this lately, and keep in mind two things. One, it takes two parties, buyer and seller, to make an agreement on the sale of a property. And you need all the proper signatures on the RPA, as well as other disclosures that come up along the course of the way. But the same is true when it comes to the cancellation. The buyer or the seller does not have the right unilaterally to cancel the escrow. So if the buyer decides they wish to cancel and the seller, for their reasons, decide they're not in agreement with that, then that agreement has to be worked out because the buyer on their own cannot cancel an escrow. As I said, it takes two to go into escrow. It takes two to come out of escrow. So make sure you get both buyer and seller's release before uploading into SkySlope, because your broker cannot approve a cancellation where there's only the buyer's signature or only the seller's signature. So please keep that in mind. Also, when it comes to cancellation, make sure you change the status of that particular transaction in escrow to cancel so that your broker can approve the cancellation. So again, other than the two signatures, both buyer and seller, you need to change the status on that document so that the buyer, your broker can approve the cancellation. Extension of time addendum. Whenever you come to the point in an escrow, and it happens quite often where an extension is required, whether it's on the buyer side or seller side, make sure you complete the extension of time document. That way, if you need to extend it one or two more times in addition to that once, that's fine. You make that change, you document that change at every step along the way. It's important from the point of view that by changing and extending an escrow time period, it may change other conditions or terms that have already been agreed on in the escrow. So again, make sure you do the extension of time as long as it's agreed to by both buyer and seller, number one. And then number two, along with the extension of time, you want to do an addendum that might change other terms of the transaction. For example, if you have a seller who needs to extend the closing, then that might cause a problem for the buyer in the regards that, number one, there may be a rate lock that is soon to expire, and to extend that there may be financial considerations that have to be made. So again, the buyer's agent is going to need to be careful of that, watch out for that, and not just let the extension of time slide without being signed. The other factor that may come into place, whereas if you have a seller that's extending their stay in the home after the close of escrow, again, that's another condition that's going to have to be considered. So if your escrow is going to be delayed, for example, 2 weeks, and in the original agreement, the seller has 5 days to move out after the close of escrow, you may want to address that term or condition in that extension of time and addendum that would be go along with that. Because now the buyer may not say, okay, I'm already extending 2 weeks, I'm not going to extend 5 more days after that. So again, that's a condition to the original agreement that'll have to be considered and discussed and negotiated at the point when you come to the end of the transaction and there's going to be an extension needed to close. Dealing with tenant, if you excuse me just one second, I have a question here. Okay, the seller's lease back. Less than 30 days, is seller required to give keys to the new owner? Yeah, they are. Okay, the question is, quick question. On a seller lease back for less than 30 days, is the seller required to give keys to the new owner? At close of escrow, yes. It's again, it can all be negotiated. So in the negotiations, buyer's agents should check with the buyer, with the new owner, whether or not they want keys to the property. If I were the buyer's agent, I would say yes. My owner, my new owner, wants the keys. So. Certainly, the seller/tenant will remain in the property for the period of time that the tenant or that the seller might remain in there, 3 days, 5 days, less than 30 days. But the new owner, needs keys. So yes, there should be a key exchange so that the owner has the ability to inspect the property, to go to the property and have access to the property. It's their home, it's their property. So certainly you have the agreement, but the owner has a right to have the keys. So I would suggest that you always provide and get a key to the new owner, even if the seller is staying in the property beyond the close of escrow. When you have a seller who's working with a tenant, they have a tenant in the property that's being sold. As a listing agent, a couple of things. One, you need to make sure that lease is up to date, that it's not expired. So you want to make sure the seller gets an up-to-date lease. Now, if the lease has expired, you want the seller to go in and put that tenant on a month-to-month lease, which is basically where they would be, I believe, anyway, unless the current lease specifies something else. But you definitely want to have that seller go in, get an up-to-date lease signed on a month-to-month basis, so that during the course of escrow, or the new owner can handle after the close of escrow. At least it gives a timetable for the tenant to be given proper notice so that they can exit the property in accordance with the lease, a current lease. The problem with an expired lease is it makes it more difficult to evict a tenant who may get upset with the fact that the home is being sold and they're being given notice to move out. So you need to, again, make sure your seller is up to date on their lease agreements with the tenants, and that with the negotiations of the sale, that the seller follows through on those negotiations to give proper notice to the tenant in a timely fashion, so that if there's an issue with the tenant not leaving, then through the lease, there will be groundwork to evict that tenant if need be. Likewise, when you're on the buyer's side of the equation and you have a tenant that you're dealing with, you need to make sure, first of all, what are the intentions of your buyer? Does your buyer, are they going to be moving into the property, which means they want the tenant, proper notice given to the tenant, so they're out at the close of escrow. So you want to make sure that happens. Or two, if they're not moving into the property, if they're buying the property as an investment type property, they may want the tenant to stay. If it's a good tenant, they're paying on time, the rent is what is the market value, then you want to have that discussion with your owner or your buyer as well. And then, assuming whatever the buyer wishes, then that gets relayed to the seller, both verbally to the seller's agent and also in writing. When you write the RPA to purchase the property and get your buyer's signature, you want to make sure you're following through in writing through the RPA, through an addendum, that whatever the buyer's wishes are. So you just want to make sure you put the seller on notice. This is the desire. We have an agreement here, and now this is what you need to do to perform to the agreement. So again, keep in mind that the buyer will need to make a decision upon making an offer on a property with a tenant as to what needs to be handled and how they wish they wish you to handle it. Number two, you want to get a copy of that lease. So you want to make sure whatever the lease is, whatever the desires of the buyer are, you want to make sure you get a copy of the lease so you can review it as the buyer's agent, and more importantly, the buyer can review it so they can see exactly what is transpiring here. If you get any indication from the seller side that there may be some difficulty in getting the tenant removed from the property, and again, this is a buyer action, you recommend it, but I want the buyer to do it, is to contact an eviction service to find out exactly what the process is for evicting a tenant should they not leave voluntarily. The reason I want the buyer to do it is because I don't want you interpreting what you're told. Your understanding of what is being told to you may not be exactly the way the process goes. And then you have the added pressure of relaying what you've been told to your buyer, and you don't know what kind of come away the buyer will have after hearing you speak as to what the process will be and the timetable will be. So again, make sure your buyer contacts the eviction service. There's a couple of good ones around. I've had agents work with them, and they are certainly worth their money. And then make sure your buyer contacts them, explain the situation, and then get their response. That way, if there's a misinterpretation on the part of the buyer, they're going to go, the misunderstanding is between them and the eviction service. You're not involved, and that way you're not getting dragged into miscommunication and getting the buyer upset with you. So you can provide all the contact information, but make sure that buyer is the one who makes the call. Same is true with the seller. If the seller is having a problem with the tenant. I ran into a situation recently where it was a duplex, both were rented. One was rented to a friend or a family member, I forget what it was now, but they didn't have a lease. That person moved in, they agreed to a rent verbally, and they did not have a lease. So you can only imagine if your buyer buys a property like that where there's no lease, it's just a verbal, it takes longer to evict. So, and in that particular case, the seller wasn't being cooperative with trying to get the buyer out of, or the tenant out of there. So again, make sure you just follow the course you need to follow to make sure your buyer's clear exactly what the situation is at the close of escrow. If you have any questions regarding a tenant situation, contact your broker so they can help you with the situation. There can be a lot of different scenarios that come out of this, and you just want to make sure you talk with your broker so that you're handling the situation right in the best interest of your client, whether that's a buyer or seller. That concludes what I have today. Again, when it comes to, just to answer that question I had early in the presentation, when you close escrow where there's a lease involved or the seller is going to be extending beyond the close of escrow, make sure your buyer has a key. You always want your buyer to have a key to the property. You have the agreement in place by the close of escrow with regards and respect to the terms and conditions of the holdover, but make sure your buyer has a key always. It's their property, it's their home. They have a right to the key, and they should have a right. They should have the key. If you have any questions, please get them to me. I will be responding throughout the day to your questions. I look forward to communicating with you. If it's more of an urgent issue, as you know, feel free to call me. I pick up or I'll call you back right away. I hope you have a good day, and I hope you have a good rest of the week. Goodbye.